What would you do if your entire world was stolen from you? Your name, your wealth, your future, all erased by the stroke of a pen from a man you never met. And then years later, when you're at your lowest point, working as a waitress to survive, his son walks in. He doesn't recognize you. To him, you're just part of the furniture. He sits at your table dripping with the wealth your family lost and begins to mock you in French, confident his cruel words are a secret language. He thinks you're nobody. He's about to learn that nobody ever is. This is the story of how a single sentence in perfect French brought a billionaire's empire to its knees. The clinking of silverware on porcelain was the soundtrack to Elara Vance's life now. It was a constant metallic rhythm that underscored the quiet hum of conversation at Le Ciel Étoilé, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. Each night she moved like a phantom between tables laden with foie gras and truffle-dusted everything, her face a mask of serene professionalism. Her uniform, a crisp black dress with a starchy white apron, was a costume she wore to hide the ghost of the woman she used to be. Just 3 years ago, Elara Vance wasn't serving $500 bottles of Chateau Margaux. She was learning how to identify them by scent alone in the cellar of her family's estate near Fontainebleau, France. Her father, Richard Vance, a world-renowned art historian and curator, had believed a proper education involved all the senses. He had taught her to distinguish a Monet from a Manet by the brush strokes, to read Victor Hugo in its original French, and to carry herself with a quiet dignity that needed no validation. That life felt like a dream she'd once had, vivid but impossibly distant. The dream had shattered with a single brutal headline in the Financial Times: Vance collection implicated in international art fraud. Her father, the most honorable man she knew, was accused of authenticating forgeries for a massive profit. His business partner, a man named Alistair Devereux, had vanished, leaving behind a mountain of fabricated evidence that pointed directly at Richard. The Vances lost everything: their reputation, their fortune, their homes. The stress and public shame broke her father's heart, literally. He suffered a massive coronary and died 6 months later, leaving Elara utterly alone at 21, with nothing but a mountain of legal debts and a tarnished name. She fled to New York, the city of reinvention, and became anonymous. Elara Vance, the Sorbonne art history graduate, became Ella, the quiet, efficient waitress at Le Ciel Étoilé. Her colleagues knew nothing of her past. To them, she was just a hard worker. Maria, a veteran waitress with kind eyes and aching feet, would often say, "You've got grace, kid. You don't belong here." Elara would just smile the words, a painful reminder of a truth she tried to forget every day. Tonight was a typical Tuesday. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. Elara glided through her section, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and maintaining the invisible bubble of privacy each table demanded. She was good at her job because she understood the clientele. She had grown up among them. She knew their casual arrogance, their easy laughter, the way they discussed million-dollar deals, as if they were planning a weekend brunch. At 8:30 p.m., the host seated a party of 3 in her most prominent section, the corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights. 2 women draped in designer labels and dripping with diamonds flanked a man who carried himself with an almost theatrical air of importance. He was tall, with sharp, dark features, and a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his body. Elara felt a faint, unnerving tremor as he sat down, a flicker of something she couldn't place. "Good evening. Welcome to Le Ciel Étoilé," she said, her voice smooth, and even as she handed them the leather-bound menus, the man didn't even look at her. He was already deep in conversation with one of the women, his hand gesturing dismissively. "Isabel, darling, you must understand. The acquisition is a formality. The board has already capitulated." "Oh, Julian, you make it sound so easy," the woman Isabel purred. The name Julian snagged in Ilara's mind, but it was a common enough name. She dismissed the feeling and stood patiently, her notepad in hand, waiting for a break in their conversation. The man, Julian, finally glanced up his gaze, sweeping over her, not as a person, but as an object, a functionary in his world. His eyes were a cold, piercing blue. For a heartbeat, she felt a jolt of recognition, a ghost of a memory she couldn't grasp. It was like seeing a face from a crowd in a long-forgotten photograph. He looked away, turning to his other companion. "Chloe, you'll have the champagne, of course." The usual. He then looked back in Ilara's general direction, without making eye contact. A bottle of Perrier Jouet Belle Époque Rosé, 2012. He didn't need to look at the menu. Of course he didn't. "An excellent choice, Sir," Ilara said, her voice betraying no emotion. As she turned to leave, she heard him speak to his friends in rapid, colloquial French, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial murmur. She froze for a fraction of a second. French. It was the language of her childhood, the language of her father, the language of her stolen life. It flowed through the restaurant's ambient noise like a poison meant only for her. She continued to the bar, the French words echoing in her head. She didn't catch what he said, but the tone was unmistakable, dismissive, arrogant. She handed the champagne order to the sommelier and took a deep breath, steeling herself. It was just another table, just another rich man. But the unsettling feeling remained. There was something about his face, his voice, his name. A phantom echo from the life that had been so cruelly ripped away. She didn't know it yet, but the ghost of her past hadn't just walked into her restaurant. He was sitting at table 12, and he was about to order his dinner. The champagne arrived, presented with the quiet theatre the bottle deserved. Ilara opened it with a practiced, subtle hiss, pouring a small amount for Julian to taste. He swirled the pale pink liquid in his glass, sniffed it with an exaggerated air of a connoisseur, and nodded his approval without a word. Ilara filled the 3 flutes and retreated to a respectful distance, her eyes scanning her other tables, but her ears tuned to table 12. Their conversation was a blend of English and French, a linguistic dance, common among the ultra-wealthy who used language as another accessory, another way to signal their membership in an exclusive club. They spoke of yachting in Monaco, of art auctions at Sotheby's, of deals and mergers that shifted fortunes and altered lives. To them it was gossip. To Ilara it was a painful travelogue of the world she had lost. She approached the table again to take their food order. Isabel and Chloe ordered the lobster thermidor and the seared scallops respectively. Julian, however, simply waved a hand at the menu. "I'll have the chef's tasting menu." "And ensure the chef is aware of who it's for," he said. His English sharp and imperious. The implication was clear he expected special treatment. Of course, Sir Ilara replied, her pen scratching against the notepad. As she was about to walk away, Julian stopped her, not by speaking to her, but by speaking about her. He turned to Isabel, a cruel little smirk playing on his lips, and switched back to French. "Regarde-la," he began, his voice a low, contemptuous murmur. "Look at her. The shoes are sensible, which is another word for cheap. You can see the exhaustion in her eyes, the face of someone who has completely given up on any dream she might have had." Ilara's blood ran cold. The words, perfectly articulated in the Parisian accent of her youth, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was less than 10 feet away, her back mostly to him, pretending to organize the salt and pepper shakers on a nearby service station. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn around to lash out. But years of forced humility had built a fortress around her emotions. She remained still a statue in a black apron. Isabel giggled a high, tinkling sound that grated on Ilara's nerves. So cruel, Julian. Perhaps she dreams of a big tip. Un pourboire ne peut pas acheter une nouvelle vie, Julian retorted, his voice dripping with condescension. A tip can't buy a new life. This is her reality. Every night, the same routine serving people like us. People who actually matter. It's almost poetic in its tragedy, don't you think? Chloe chimed in, her French, less polished but equally venomous. I wonder what she thinks about all day. Probably nothing. It's better that way. An empty head for an empty life. An empty head. An empty life. The words ricocheted inside Ilara's skull. She thought of her father's library, of the thousands of books she had read. She thought of debating Foucault and Derrida with her professors at the Sorbonne. She thought of standing before a real Van Gogh, so close she could see the frantic energy in every impastoed swirl of paint, and feeling the profound soul-shaking connection to the artist. And here she was, being called empty, by people whose only discernible skill was spending money they likely hadn't earned. The injustice of it all was a burning acid in her throat. Her hands, hidden behind her back, clenched into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms. The pain was a welcome anchor in the storm of her fury. She had to move. She had to place their order. She took a single shuddering breath, locking the rage away in a deep, cold vault within her heart. With movements that felt stiff and robotic, she walked to the kitchen's computer terminal. She punched in the order, her fingers trembling slightly. Liam, one of the line cooks, and her closest friend in this new life, saw her face under the harsh, fluorescent lights. He was a kind, steady presence, a young chef from Queens, with more talent in his little finger than Julian had in his entire body. "You okay, Ella?" he asked softly, wiping his hands on his apron. "Table 12 giving you trouble. That guy looks like a real piece of work." She couldn't bring herself to repeat the words. How could she explain the specific, tailored cruelty of it? How could she say, "He insulted my very existence in the language my father taught me to love"? So she just shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "They're just demanding," she managed to say. "Nothing I can't handle." But as she walked back out into the hushed elegance of the dining room, she knew it was a lie. This was different. This wasn't just a rude customer. The man's words were a direct assault on her past, her intelligence, her humanity. He had looked at the ghost of Ilara Vance, and seeing only a waitress had decided to spit on her. She served their appetizers with an unshakable calm, her movements fluid and precise. Julian and his companions ignored her, their laughter, and French insults continuing unabated. They were so cocooned in their arrogance, so certain of their superiority, that the thought that their server, this non-entity in a uniform, could understand their secret conversation was beyond the realm of possibility. And as she stood by her station, waiting, an idea began to form. It was a terrifying, reckless, and utterly electrifying thought. They believed she was nothing. They believed she was empty. They had handed her the perfect weapon, their own ignorance. The vault of rage inside her was no longer just a prison for her pain. It was becoming an arsenal. The main courses were served. The lobster was deshelled tableside, the scallops arranged in a perfect glistening fan. For Julian, the chef had prepared a 7-course tasting menu, each plate a miniature work of art. Ilara described each dish to him in polite, clipped English, her voice a placid lake over a raging volcano. With every description, he would offer a curt nod, his attention already back on his companions before she had finished speaking. Their French commentary continued a venomous undercurrent to the meal. They critiqued her posture, mocked the way she poured the wine, and speculated on the miserable state of her finances. Each word was a fresh log on the fire burning inside Ilara. She absorbed it all, her expression unreadable. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an ethnographer studying a tribe of entitled predators in their natural habitat. She was waiting for the perfect moment. Not a moment of anger, but one of absolute control. A moment when the silence would be her stage and her words would be the spotlight. It came after the main course during the lull before dessert. The conversation had drifted, and Julian was holding court, telling a story about a corporate takeover. He was leaning back, one arm draped casually over the back of the booth, the picture of a man at the apex of his world. He had just delivered the punchline, and his friends were laughing appreciatively. Ilara approached the table, a silver crummer in her hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice still quiet and in English. She began to clear the breadcrumbs from the tablecloth around him, her movements deliberate and graceful. It was an intimate, subservient gesture. Julian paused, his story annoyed by the interruption, and watched her with a look of mild irritation. He turned to Isabelle, and without bothering to lower his voice, made his final, most cutting remark in French. "C'est le seul moment où elle est proche de la richesse en balayant les miettes de notre table. This is the closest she'll ever get to wealth sweeping the crumbs from our table." The laughter from Isabelle and Chloe was sharp and clear in the momentary quiet. That was it. That was the moment. Ilara didn't stop what she was doing. She continued her slow, meticulous sweep of the crumbs into her silver pan. Then, without looking up, she spoke. Her voice was low, calm, and perfectly clear. And it was in French, a French far more pure and academic than his. "Monsieur," she began the single word, cutting through the air and silencing the table instantly. "Les miettes comme les gens peuvent paraître petites et sans importance. Mais même la plus petite miette garde le souvenir d'avoir été autrefois partie du pain." She straightened up slowly, and finally, for the first time that night, met his gaze directly. Her eyes, which he had described as empty, were now burning with a cold, intelligent fire. She held his stare, refusing to back down. Julian's smirk froze on his face. The color began to drain from his cheeks. Isabelle and Chloe exchanged confused, startled glances. Ilara continued her French, flowing like poetry, each word a precisely aimed dart. "Et quant à ma tête vide, je la trouve bien meublée, merci." Parfois le silence d'une serveuse contient plus de pensées et d'observations que toutes les clameurs d'un homme riche qui n'a rien à dire. Her translation for the silent, shocked table would have been, "So crumbs like people can seem small and unimportant. But even the smallest crumb holds the memory of once being part of the whole loaf. And as for my empty head, I find it quite well furnished, thank you." Sometimes the silence of a waitress holds more thoughts and observations than all the clamoring of a rich man with nothing to say. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound that the distant clatter from the kitchen seemed deafening. Julian Devereux was completely, utterly frozen. His jaw was slack, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of shock and horror. He looked as if she had just slapped him. In a way she had far harder than a physical blow could ever land. She had taken his weapon, his secret language of contempt, and turned it back on him with devastating precision. Isabelle and Chloe stared, their mouths slightly agape. They didn't need a perfect translation to understand what had just happened. They had witnessed a public execution of ego. The power dynamic at the table hadn't just shifted, it had been annihilated. Ilara held her ground for another second, letting her victory settle in the thick, stunned air. Then, with the crumbs collected, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Will you be having dessert this evening?" she asked, switching back to flawless professional English as if nothing had happened. The question was so mundane, so absurdly normal after the linguistic bomb she had just detonated, that it shattered the spell. Julian flinched. He couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just stared at her, this waitress, this nobody, who had just exposed him as a cruel, boorish fool in front of his friends. He pushed his chair back violently, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "The check," he choked out in English, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Now." "Right away, sir," Ilara said, turning on her heel with a poise she hadn't felt in 3 years. As she walked away, she didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel anger. She felt the exhilarating, terrifying return of a woman she thought was dead and buried, Ilara Vance. The walk to the point-of-sale system felt like a mile. Ilara's heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and fear. Her hands were steady as she printed the bill, but inside she was trembling. She had just committed the cardinal sin of the service industry. She had confronted a customer. She had shattered the invisible wall between server and served. By any normal standard, she should be fired on the spot. But the look on his face, the utter soul-shaking shock, had been worth it. She placed the leather bill folder on the table without a word. Julian snatched it. His movements were jerky, his earlier composure completely gone. He fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy. He threw a black credit card onto the folder and pushed it to the edge of the table, still refusing to look at her. Ilara picked it up and walked back to the terminal. Maria caught her eye from across the room, her expression a mixture of worry and awe. The entire staff had noticed the commotion, the sudden charged atmosphere around table 12. Under the harsh light of the service station, Ilara looked down at the credit card. It was a Centurion card, the legendary black card, reserved for the world's wealthiest individuals, and embossed on it was the name that would change everything. Julian Devereux. The name hit her with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't just a familiar name. It was the name from the headlines, the name of her father's business partner, the name of the man who had orchestrated her family's ruin, Alistair Devereux. Could this be him? This man was too young, perhaps in his late 30s. A son, a relative, the blood drained from her face. The restaurant around her seemed to warp and fade, the sounds blurring into a dull roar. The ghost of a memory she'd been feeling all night solidified into a horrifying certainty. She remembered now. A Christmas party, years ago, at her family's home. A tall, dark-haired man named Alistair had been there with his sullen, arrogant teenage son. A son named Julian. He hadn't been mocking a random waitress. Julian Devereux, the son of the man who destroyed her father, had been unknowingly mocking Ilara Vance, the daughter of the man he had wronged. The cosmic, cruel irony of it was staggering. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a reckoning. She swiped the card, her mind racing. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying speed. Alistair Devereux had vanished after the scandal broke, taking the stolen millions with him. Of course, his son was living a life of obscene luxury. He was spending her family's money. He was dining on the legacy of her father's stolen reputation. The champagne he drank, the suit he wore, the very air of untouchable power he projected, it was all funded by the Vance's downfall. Her rage returned, no longer hot and impulsive, but cold hard and terrifyingly clear. This was no longer about a personal insult. This was about justice. She walked back to the table, the bill and the card in hand. Julian and his companions were sitting in a thick, uncomfortable silence. He had his coat on, clearly desperate to flee. Ilara placed the folder on the table. "Thank you, Mr. Devereux," she said, her voice clear and measured. She put a slight, deliberate emphasis on his name. At the sound of it from her lips, Julian's head snapped up. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face, a dawning, panicked question in them. Did she know? How could she know? For the first time, he was truly seeing her, not the uniform but the face, the high cheekbones, the intelligent eyes. Was there a flicker of familiarity? Ilara held his gaze, letting him see the recognition in her own eyes. She let him see that she knew exactly who he was. She had taken his power in the restaurant. Now she was threatening the foundations of his entire world, and he could feel it. Without another word, he snatched the folder, scribbled a signature without adding a tip, and stood up. "Let's go," he bit out to his friends. They scurried after him, avoiding eye contact with Ilara, as if she were the harbinger of some terrible plague. She watched them go, Julian Devereux's broad, tense back, disappearing through the restaurant's heavy oak doors. He was running. Liam was by her side the second she stepped away from the table. "What in God's name did you say to that guy? He looked like he'd seen a ghost." Ilara leaned against the service station, her legs suddenly weak. She looked at Liam, her friend, the only person in this city who truly cared for her. "I think," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I just served my family's ghost." Later that night, in her small, cramped apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of apartment that cost a fortune, but was a world away from Julian Devereux's life. Ilara sat in front of her laptop. The name Devereux was a key unlocking a Pandora's box of painful memories. She typed Julian Devereux into the search bar. The results flooded the screen. CEO of Devereux Holdings, a private equity firm known for aggressive, ruthless acquisitions. Countless articles in Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, lauding him as a titan of industry, a visionary. They all mentioned his father Alistair, the firm's founder, now retired and living privately abroad, living privately on stolen money. Ilara's hands flew across the keyboard. She searched for Devereux Holdings and its connection to the art world. It took hours of digging through financial reports and old news archives, but she found it. A shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands had been used to purchase the collection of forged paintings. That shell corporation had been dissolved, but not before transferring its assets to another entity, which was eventually absorbed by a subsidiary of Devereux Holdings. It was the thread, the connection. Alistair had not only framed her father, he had used his own company to launder the money, cementing it into the foundations of the empire his son now commanded. She pushed back from the screen, her heart pounding with a terrible, fierce clarity. Julian wasn't just the beneficiary of the crime. His entire empire was built upon it, and he had just mocked the one person on earth who had the motivation and the knowledge to burn it all to the ground. She thought of her father, of his kindness, his passion, and the utter despair in his eyes in his final months. The fire that had been lit in the restaurant was now a controlled inferno. This was no longer about an apology or getting him fired. This was about reclaiming a legacy. Julian Devereux had swept the crumbs from his table. Ilara Vance was about to take back the entire loaf. The next morning, Ilara called the restaurant and quit. She told the manager there was a family emergency. In a way, it was the truth. The emergency had begun 3 years ago, and she was finally ready to address it. Maria was the only person she told the real reason, her voice, a hushed, urgent whisper over the phone. "Be careful, mija. Maria had warned, her voice thick with concern. Men like that, they don't just have money. They have power. They crush people. People have been trying to crush me for 3 years, Maria Ilara had replied, a newfound steel in her voice. I'm done being crushed. Her first stop was a storage unit in Queens, a place she hadn't visited since she first arrived in New York. It was a 10 by 10 foot box of ghosts. Inside were the last remnants of her former life furniture, draped in white sheets, boxes of photos, and most importantly, her father's office. After he died before the banks seized everything, she'd had the presence of mind to pack every document, every file, every notebook from his study. She hadn't been able to bear looking at them. Until now, for the next 48 hours, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning sense of purpose, Ilara transformed her tiny apartment into a war room. She unsealed the boxes, the scent of old paper and her father's pipe tobacco filling the air. It was a heartbreaking reunion. There, in his elegant, scholarly handwriting, was the story of his life's work and his betrayal. He had saved everything: memos, transaction records, emails printed out, and a small leather-bound ledger. In this ledger, her meticulous, detail-oriented father had privately documented his growing unease about Alistair Devereux. He'd noted strange wire transfers Shell corporations Alistair had mentioned in passing, and discrepancies in acquisition paperwork. He had been on the verge of uncovering the fraud himself when Alistair struck first, using her father's own notes and access to frame him perfectly. It was all there. The names of the Shell corporations, the account numbers, the timeline. It was a roadmap to the crime. She cross-referenced the names and numbers from the ledger with the corporate structures of Devereux Holdings she'd found online. It was a complex web of deceit designed to be impenetrable. But her father had provided the key. She saw how Alistair had funneled the money from the fraudulent art sales through 3 different countries before it landed clean and shiny in the asset portfolio of his primary company. This was the smoking gun. It wasn't just a vague accusation, it was documented proof. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Her first thought was to go to the authorities, but she hesitated. Alistair had fooled Interpol and the FBI 3 years ago. His son, with his army of high-priced lawyers, would bury this evidence in legal motions and drown her in litigation until she was broke and silenced. She couldn't fight him on his turf. She had to fight him on hers. She thought of Liam. He had called her a dozen times, worried sick. She finally answered. "Ella, what's going on?" "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Liam," she said, her voice strained with exhaustion and excitement. "Actually, I'm better than fine. But I need your help. Can you come over?" When Liam arrived at her apartment, he found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by a sea of paper. She looked manic, her hair unkempt, her eyes shining with an intensity he'd never seen before. She told him everything, the whole story, about her father, the Vance collection, the betrayal, and the man at table 12. Liam listened, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally to a quiet, simmering anger on her behalf. He wasn't a lawyer or a detective, but he was practical street smart and fiercely loyal. "So this whole empire, it's built on a lie," he said, picking up one of her father's notebooks and looking at the elegant script with reverence. "Worse," Ilara said, pointing to a complex diagram she had drawn on a whiteboard. "It's built on a crime that destroyed my family. And Julian Devereux is living in the house that crime built." "So what's the plan? You can't just walk up to him and show him this stuff." "No," Ilara agreed. "That's not the plan. Men like Devereux only understand one thing: leverage. His entire public persona is built on being a genius, an untouchable titan of finance. He cultivates an image of old money, of sophistication. She gestured to the memory of the restaurant. That's why he speaks French. That's why he mocks waitresses. It's all a performance to hide the grubby truth of where his money came from. And I'm going to threaten to bring the whole stage down. She explained her idea. It wasn't to expose him immediately. It was to confront him first, to give him a choice. Public exposure is a messy, unpredictable weapon. A direct threat, however, was precise. I need to find a way to get to him. Not at his office, surrounded by his guards and lawyers. Somewhere else. Somewhere the playing field is more level. Liam nodded, his mind working. The restaurant world is small, Ella. The circles these guys run in, they're predictable. They go to the same charity galas, the same restaurant openings. Let me make some calls. A friend of mine is a sous chef at the Pendry. They're hosting a big benefit for the Met next week. Patrons of the Arts Gala. I bet my last dollar he'll be there. Patrons of the Arts. The irony was so thick, Elara could have choked on it. Julian Devereux, whose fortune was built on art fraud, being celebrated as a patron of the arts. It was perfect. Get me a ticket, Liam, Elara said, her eyes gleaming. Or better yet, get me a staff uniform. I've had enough of being a guest in that world. It's time I went back to work. The plan was set. Elara spent the next few days consolidating her father's evidence into a damning, undeniable dossier. She made digital copies, storing them on encrypted drives, which she mailed to 3 different locations, including one to Maria, with strict instructions. It was her insurance policy. She wasn't just fighting for restitution anymore. She was fighting for her father's name. Julian Devereux had mocked her for sweeping up crumbs. He was about to find out what happens when one of those crumbs holds the memory of the entire world he had stolen. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a palace of light and sound. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling of the Great Hall, casting a golden glow on the city's elite. Women in haute couture gowns floated through the crowd, champagne flutes in hand, while men in bespoke tuxedos discussed stocks and mergers beside priceless Roman sculptures. It was a world Elara knew intimately, and one she now moved through like a spy. Liam had come through. Through his network of kitchen staff, he'd secured her a position with the catering company for the night. Dressed once again in a simple black uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, she was invisible. She carried a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her eyes scanning the glittering assembly. It didn't take long to find him. Julian Devereux stood near the Temple of Denda, holding court with a senator and a tech mogul. He was a portrait of success, laughing, charming, radiating power. He looked completely at ease, the incident at the restaurant, seemingly forgotten, a minor annoyance already erased from his life. He had no idea a ghost from his past was circling him, tray in hand. Elara's heart pounded a frantic bird against her ribs. This was it. She took a steadying breath, remembering her father's lessons on dignity. Never let them see you sweat, mon chou. She waited her patience, a coiled spring. She watched him detach from the group and head towards the less crowded European sculpture and decorative arts wing, presumably for a quieter conversation or a moment alone. This was her chance. She placed her tray on a nearby service table and followed him, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished marble floors. She found him standing before Rodin's The Burghers of Calais, his back to her, staring at the tortured bronze figures. It's a powerful piece, isn't it? Her voice, calm and clear, sliced through the quiet of the gallery. Julian spun around his face, a mask of irritation at being disturbed. When he saw her, the irritation morphed into stunned disbelief, followed by a flash of genuine fear. It was the waitress. "You," he breathed, his voice a harsh whisper. "What are you doing here? Are you following me?" I work here tonight, Ilara said simply, her gaze as unyielding as the statues around them. But that's not why I'm here. We need to talk. I have absolutely nothing to say to you, he hissed, turning to leave. I do, Ilara said, her voice stopping him in his tracks. I have a great deal to say to you, Julian, or should I say to the son of Alistair Devereux. His name connected to his father's hung in the air between them like an indictment. He froze, his shoulders tensing. He slowly turned back to face her. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The mask of the charming billionaire was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating face of a cornered animal. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice low and threatening. Oh, I think you do, Ilara said, taking a step closer. She was no longer afraid. Seeing him here surrounded by the very art his family had profaned gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. I want to talk about shell corporations, about fraudulent provenances. I want to talk about a man named Richard Vance. Julian's face went pale. He glanced around nervously, but the gallery was empty. They were alone with the ghosts of art and history. You're mistaken, he said, his voice tight. Am I? Ilara pressed on her own voice, gaining strength. My father kept a ledger, Mr. Devereux. A very detailed one. It seems he had his suspicions about your father, long before the end. He documented everything. It makes for fascinating reading. It's a road map, really. A road map of a crime that leads directly from a forged art collection through a series of offshore accounts and ends up as the foundation of Devereux Holdings. She watched him process the information. She could see the calculations whirling behind his cold blue eyes. Denial, threats, intimidation. She was ready for all of it. You have no proof, he finally spat out. You're a bitter little girl making up stories. You're angry you have to serve canapes for a living while I own the building. I could have you fired. I could have you arrested for harassment. You could, Ilara agreed calmly. But then my father's ledger, along with a comprehensive dossier detailing every transaction, would be sent to Sarah Jenkins at the Financial Times. I believe you know her. She wrote that glowing profile on you last spring. I imagine she'd be very interested in writing a follow-up piece. The headline might be something like, "The Devereux Empire, a Masterpiece of Fraud." Julian's jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle throbbing. He had underestimated her at the restaurant, and he was realizing with dawning horror that he was underestimating her now. What do you want? He finally asked, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Money. The question was so predictable, so insulting, that Ilara almost laughed. You think this is about money? You think I can be bought off with the very currency you stole from my family? This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Devereux. This is a reckoning. She took another step, closing the distance between them, until she could speak in a low, intense voice that no one else could possibly overhear. Here is what you are going to do. You are going to establish a foundation in my father's name. The Richard Vance Foundation for the authentication and preservation of art. It will be endowed with a sum sufficient to restore his name and undo the damage your family has caused. $200 million to start. You are also going to issue a public statement clearing his name completely, attributing the fraud to your missing father, Alistair. You will claim new evidence has come to light. And finally, you will provide full financial restitution to my family for what was stolen. The original value plus interest. He stared at her aghast. You're insane. That would ruin me. No, Ilara corrected him. The truth will ruin you. I am offering you an alternative, a way to control the narrative. You can be the son who righted his father's wrongs, the reformer who cleaned house. It's a much better story than being the heir to a criminal enterprise. Don't you think you have 24 hours to have your lawyers contact me? If I hear nothing, the dossier goes to the press. And I assure you my evidence is far more compelling than your denials." She looked past him at the bronze figures of Rodin's masterpiece men who had sacrificed themselves for their city. Her father had been a man like that, a man of principle. "My father died because of what your father did," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, all traces of strategy replaced by raw, painful truth. "He died in shame, believing the world thought him a criminal. You built your life on top of his grave. Now you're going to build his monument." Without waiting for a reply, Elara turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the gallery. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had seen the look in his eyes. It was the look of a king who had just been checkmated by a pawn. The next 24 hours were the longest of Elara's life. She stayed in her apartment with Liam, the silence stretching for hours, broken only by the ticking of a clock and the distant wail of city sirens. She didn't know if Julian would call. He was powerful, arrogant, and cornered. He could try anything, threaten her hire investigators to dig up dirt on her, or even flee. At 4:30 p.m. the next day, her burner phone rang. The number was blocked. She answered, her heart in her throat. "Hello." A crisp, professional voice on the other end spoke. "Am I speaking to Miss Vance?" "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the lead counsel for Mr. Julian Devereux. He has asked me to open a channel of communication with you regarding a philanthropic matter." Elara closed her eyes in a wave of relief, so profound her knees felt weak. He had folded. The king had abdicated. "I'm listening," she said. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense negotiations. Julian's lawyers, led by Thorne, tried every trick to water down the terms. They argued over the endowment amount. The wording of the press released the definition of restitution. But Elara, with the help of a pro bono lawyer from a non-profit for victims of corporate fraud that Liam had found, held firm. She had the leverage and she knew it. She wasn't negotiating for profit. She was negotiating for justice, and on that there could be no compromise. Finally, they reached an agreement. A month later, the news broke, sending shock waves through the financial and art worlds. A press release from Devereux Holdings announced the discovery of newly unearthed evidence that posthumously exonerated the late Richard Vance of all involvement in the 2022 art fraud scandal. The blame was laid squarely on Alistair Devereux, whose current whereabouts were unknown. Simultaneously, the firm announced the launch of the Richard Vance Foundation, a massive non-profit dedicated to ethical art authentication with an inaugural endowment of $250 million. Julian Devereux was quoted as saying, "It is a tragedy that a man of Mr. Vance's integrity had his reputation unfairly tarnished. Devereux Holdings is committed to righting this historic wrong and honoring his incredible legacy." The story was spun as a triumph of corporate responsibility. Julian was hailed in some circles as a courageous son, cleaning up his fugitive father's mess. Elara watched his televised press conference from her apartment. He looked tired, diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a carefully rehearsed humility. Their eyes met through the screen, and she knew that he knew that she was watching. He had won the public relations battle, but she had won the war. The final piece fell into place a week later, when a wire transfer of a staggering sum. The calculated value of her family's lost assets, compounded over 3 years, appeared in an account her lawyer had set up. She was no longer just Ella, the waitress. She was Elara Vance, and she was by any measure wealthy again. But the money felt different this time. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a reclamation. It was earned not through stocks or bonds, but through courage and pain. She didn't return to the life she'd had. You can never go home again, not really. That world of careless luxury seemed as alien to her now as her waitress uniform had once been. The struggle had changed her, forged her into someone stronger, more purposeful. With a portion of the funds, she purchased a modest but beautiful brownstone in Greenwich Village. She designated the entire ground floor to be the new headquarters of the Vance Foundation. She took the title of executive director. Her first hire was Liam, who had decided that while he loved cooking, his real passion was helping her build this new legacy. He became the foundation's chief of operations. Her days were no longer filled with the clatter of plates, but with meetings with art historians, museum curators, and forensic specialists. She was building something real, something that would protect artists and collectors, something that would make the art world safer and more honest. She was finishing her father's work. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was walking through Washington Square Park with Liam discussing a new grant program. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. "Do you ever think about him?" Liam asked quietly. Devereux Elara considered it for a moment, watching the light catch in the leaves. "Sometimes. I don't hate him. I don't think I have the energy for it. I see him as a symbol of a world that believes some people are invisible. He mocked a waitress because he didn't think she had a story. He was wrong." She smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "Everyone has a story," she said, tucking her arm into Liam's. "And I'm finally getting to write my own ending." She was no longer a ghost, and no longer a waitress. She was Elara Vance, the guardian of a legacy, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. And in the quiet dignity of her new life, she found a wealth far greater than any Julian Devereux could ever comprehend. The story of Elara Vance is a powerful reminder that there is no such thing as an insignificant person. The world may try to label us, to put us in boxes, to judge us by our uniform or our job. But inside every person is a history, a depth of knowledge, and a strength that others may not see. Elara's story is about more than just revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about taking back the narrative that was stolen from you and rewriting it with courage and integrity. It proves that the most powerful voice can sometimes come from the quietest person in the room, and that true justice isn't about tearing someone down, but about building a legacy that can never be broken again. If you were inspired by Elara's incredible resilience and her fight for justice, please let us know in the comments. What part of her story moved you the most? Don't forget to hit that like button. If you believe in the power of the underdog, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of triumph against the odds. Thank you for listening.